This is an introductory video on the Uncial style of calligraphy. It's the style of calligraphy that we most associate with the Middle Ages. And indeed, it's the style that was used by monks in their scriptoriums, where they were scribing or writing down on large manuscripts knowledge to be preserved. The Uncial style of calligraphy, as you can see, does not have any capital letters that stand out in the traditional sense. The letters are all very uniform, except with some very short ascenders and some very short descenders. Now, in order to get started, our students will need, of course, a pad of paper, which is very helpful. In our cases, they'll be working quite a bit in their main lesson books, so that can serve as a pad of paper. They'll need a clean eraser, a sharp pencil, and of course a calligraphy pen. This is a Mercurius style of calligraphy pen with a medium size nib. You can get a nib size that is larger than this, as well as one that is smaller. But I find that the medium width works very well with the style of writing that they will do in their main lesson books. You may also want to get a calligraphy marker, which you can find at most office supply places. And that will allow them to write titles. I always find it a missed opportunity when students write titles using a calligraphy pen, and that'll become evident as to why when we get started here. Now, in order to have or to achieve this certain look, we have to be rigorous and work within certain constraints. And this approach, just like in geometry, the lawfulness, if we follow certain rules, then the outcome is something that we can rely on. And in this case, the outcome is very satisfying and it is very beautiful. And this is something that the 12-year-old is actually searching for inwardly, is how to find this sense of inner order. And so calligraphy, like geometry, has a wonderful counterbalancing effect at this time of year in their stage of development. So now to begin, when we introduce calligraphy, we need to begin with a baseline. And then each style of calligraphy is based on a certain number of nibs stacked up in height. So the Uncial style of calligraphy is based on a body height of 4 nibs. So here's how we prepare our page. We begin with a baseline, which I've already drawn a number of them, and then we indicate, we stack, like bricks, we stack 4 nib heights. And that will be the height of the body of our letters. And so I'm just going to go ahead and do this on each line of paper in preparation. Now, of course, you don't want to do this necessarily in a main lesson book and then be stuck with this kind of technical guideline. But what you can very easily do is have this on a piece of paper and then use that as your guide. So once we have the height of the body of letters set, then all we have to do is draw a construction line, as we would call it in geometry. So a very faint line that we'll be using as a guide. And I'll just repeat that on these other ones. We don't want to press hard because, as you can see in the title that I created here, we will be erasing our guide lines afterwards. So these are just very, very light lines just for us to see, but not to be seen afterwards. So now we have our page set up, and I'm just going to walk you through some little details about how to create these letters. So just like every style of calligraphy has a certain height, a body height based on the number of nibs, in this case 4, every style of calligraphy is also based on a certain angle at which we are holding the nib. So this would be a 45-degree angle, but in the Uncial, we're aiming more for a 20-degree angle. So this becomes quite automatic for the students, but I'll just set it up here for us to see. So 20 degrees approximately is going to be roughly this angle. And that is precise enough. Now, the best way to introduce this style of writing is by grouping the letters that are most similar. So in this case, we're going to start with letters that are the most rounded letters. And so I'm going to check my nib angle, and we're going to start with an O, which has 2 strokes. Next, we'll do a C, which is based also on 2 strokes. Now, what's very important is that you only really get one chance. You can't really go back and go over a stroke because you won't have this kind of perfect connection. So you want to get it right from the beginning. Another letter that is very rounded and is part of this family would be the G. As you can see, they all start very similarly. That's why it makes sense to introduce these together. And then the E. The D, which I've found has always been one of the favorites with my students. Again, it starts just like all the others, and it has a little ascender with a serif. A serif is a little hook And you can see the D just stands slightly above our top guideline. And the last one in this series will be the T. And it starts the same way. So these are our rounded letters. Next, well, you don't have to introduce them in this order, but in this little tutorial, the next group of letters we'll write are what we can call the straight letters. So we have the I. It starts with a little hook or little serif. It's very important that it stays very vertical. Sometimes the students will end up leaning their letters, but this is not that style. And so there are other styles of calligraphy where their letters are much more leaned. But in this one, they're very upright. The next sort of straight letter that is based on the I is the J. The very short descender. And then we have the L, which starts with an ascender and a small hook. And then the F, which may look like a capital letter, but we're writing it all within the same height. And it starts with our next set of letters now are ones that blend both straight and curved lines. So those would be, for example, let's start with the N. So the N begins with a serif, straight down, very vertical, and it comes in. We will do next is the M, which, as you guessed it, just repeats this form. So we begin almost like an N, but instead of curving in, we'll come straight down. And then we'll repeat the N the second time. Now, there are always variations on these letters. One variation is to add a little serif at the bottom. So let me just demonstrate what that would look like with an N. And with an M. I didn't quite curve this one enough. So I am going to actually cross this one out on my practice sheet and do it over. I like that better. Next, in our blended straight and curved letters would be an H. So the H starts slightly above the guideline with a serif, a very short ascender, and then a large rounded body. And again, it can have a serif or not. I'll add a serif to it. Next we have the U, which begins this way, one stroke. Second stroke is curved, and the third stroke is straight down with a little tail. Next we'll go with the W. Let's do the P. That is also a straight and curved letter. It dips down just a little bit, and it has also a very wide, rounded body. And then the Q, which is very similar, but in reverse. So we'll start like we did with the C, slightly below the top guideline. Add this portion, and then, you guessed it, we just come straight down. And we can add a little tail to it. And our next series are the diagonal letters. So let's start with an A, for example. Start with and then the V. Starts with a hook, and the second line also starts with a hook. And then the X. So we have a little hook here and a hook here, and then straight across. And the Z. First stroke, second stroke, third, and if you want a bit of a flourish, fourth stroke. And then we have what I call these more stodgy, blocky letters, and I'll just do them on this line. This would be the B, the R, like the B, and the S, which is a tricky letter. The S is based on 3 strokes. So it starts with this middle portion, to which we add a top and a bottom. This is the letter that gives the students the hardest time. And then the K, which again we can start with a small serif. I left out one letter in this category, and you have probably noticed which one. It is based on the U, and that is the Y. So let's add that one. So it starts just like the U, except now we bring straight down, and we have this short descender. So these are our basic ways of constructing these letters. And it's important to tell the students that we can't really take any shortcuts. We can't just draw a no the way we would do in one single stroke. You just won't end up with the same effect. So it's very important for them to know that each letter has a certain number of strokes, independent strokes, that it is based on. So what I would suggest is introducing this style of calligraphy by grouping the letters. And then, of course, on practice paper, they can write their names and so on. When it comes to writing in their main lesson books, something like a title, it's very helpful to just write it out first on a piece of paper so that they can then gauge where to write it on their page so that it'll be centered, or it'll be wherever they intend it to be, and it doesn't end up all squished to one side or awkwardly off center. So always do something on a piece of practice paper. Once the ink has dried, of course, that's when we can use our eraser and remove the guide lines. Another tip I have for introducing this style of calligraphy is to use a blackboard and something that you can find in a hardware store. I'm not sure what we call these, but this is basically a sponge brush with a very wide nib. I'm sure it wasn't intended to be called a nib, but for our purposes, this is a nib. And so what we can do is we can dip this in some water, and the students love this activity of coming up to the board and drawing with this wet sponge, these nib heights, and then practicing letters. And so we'll do just one N. Again, check my nib angle. I start with a bit of a serif, come straight down. So it's very satisfying. It really makes them aware of the strokes, the different angles, and then magically, as in when they step back, the letter slowly disappears. So I really recommend you getting a bunch of these for your classes so that students can come up to the board, maybe 6, 7 at a time, and just practice some letters. The other thing I recommend, I mentioned in the beginning, was to get a set of calligraphy markers that you can find in an office supply store. Again, they may not be called calligraphy markers, but just look for the kind of marker that has a straight nib. Maybe not every student has a marker, and that's okay. You can have, if you have 20 students, maybe 10 markers. And those would only be used really for creating titles. They would not be used for the regular writing that we would do using our calligraphy pens. So it's well worth having enough markers that you can pass around so that when it's time to do titles, they can do something that stands out. I think now we understand why it's not a good idea to use the pen to create the titles, because titles need to stand out, they need to be larger, and if we use this kind of a nib for a title, then we will lose all the proportions and beauty of this style of calligraphy. And that is true for any style that you use. All right, there's another video on the Roman hand, or the Roman style of calligraphy. That's the other one that you'll probably be using. Other ones to explore are the Gothic hand, and you can find tutorials on those on YouTube. And the italic hand comes a little bit more next year in 7th grade. So I would just hold off on that, and unless they discover it for themselves, really I would wait till 7th grade to bring the italic hand. All right, thank you.